It's just after dawn in rural Minnesota, September 1974. A farmer walks the edge of his cornfield, boots wet with dew, following the same path he takes every morning. But today, something's wrong. The rows don't look right. There's a disturbed patch of earth, as if something heavy has been dragged or dropped there in the night. He steps closer and stops dead. Lying in the flattened stalks is the body of a young woman. 18 years old, her skull has been shattered by what seems to be repeated blows from something blunt and heavy. Later, detectives will say it looked like her head had been imploded. There are signs of sexual assault. It is the kind of scene that makes even seasoned investigators look away in horror. Within days, this murder will be linked to another young woman who'd gone missing weeks earlier, and to a cluster of brutal attacks on teenage girls who somehow managed to survive being beaten and assaulted with a hammer. Those survivors will sit in interview rooms shaking and telling police the same thing. A stocky, middle-aged man driving an old truck offered them a lift, a ride home, or a job, and then turned into something else entirely. When detectives finally stop that truck and pull the driver out, they'll find road maps with neat red circles marking the locations of attacks. His name is Harvey Louis Carignan. By the time he's arrested in 1974, he's in his 50s. Soft around the middle, balding slightly. He doesn't look like the sort of man you'd build a horror story about. But here's the thing. This isn't the first time Harvey Carignan has stood in a courtroom listening to a judge pronounce the word death. 25 years earlier, in the territory of Alaska, he was sentenced to hang for the murder of a 58-year-old woman he'd attacked during an attempted sexual assault. Then, on a legal technicality, he would walk away from the gallows. Tonight, we're going to follow the long, ugly line that runs from the first killing in 1949 through reform schools, federal prisons, gas station want ads, hitchhiking teenagers, and a series of hammer attacks. Until eventually the man was finally stopped. The man the newspapers would call the want ad killer. This is the story of Harvey Carignan. My name's Jack Lawrence. Welcome to Crime at Bedtime. Before we head back to the story of the want ad killer, it's time to take a minute. Time to relax and focus on our breathing. As always, we'll utilize the 4-6-8 method, breathing in slow and deep through the nose for 4 seconds, filling the lungs, holding the breath for 6 before breathing out slow and controlled for 8. Here we go. Breathing in for 4, hold, and slowly and controlled back out. And again, slowly breathing in deep, filling the lungs for 4, holding, and slowly and controlled back out again. One more time, breathing in deep, slow, through the nose, filling the lungs for 4 seconds, holding for 6, and slowly and controlled back out again. Now, as you breathe normally, let's head back to the 18th of May, 1927, in North Dakota, where a child is born, a child who would later become known as the Want and Killer. Harvey Louis Carignan was born to a 20-year-old unmarried mother in a time and place where that carries a heavy social weight. He doesn't grow up with a stable home or a consistent sense of belonging. Instead, his childhood is chopped up between his mother, relatives in North Dakota and Minnesota, and the state. The official records we do have paint the picture of a kid who never quite fit. At school, he struggled badly. At around 10, he was sent to a reform school in Mandan, North Dakota. There, doctors would give him several diagnoses. One for a neurological condition that can cause involuntary movements, and the other for chronic bedwetting. Bedwetting that continues well beyond the age where most children grow out of it. Those two details keep cropping up in later psychological reports, the kind of early life markers people point to when they're trying to understand how a boy becomes what Harvey would eventually become. What everyone agrees on is that he leaves that reform school as a teenager with very little education and no obvious path into normal adult life. So, he takes one of the classic exits available to young men in the 1940s. He heads to the army. At 18, Harvey enlists in the US Army and is posted thousands of kilometers from the plains of North Dakota to Anchorage, in the territory of Alaska. It's 1940s Anchorage, remote, harsh, full of transient workers and servicemen. For a young man with poor impulse control and a history of behavioural problems, it's not a great mix. On the 31st of July 1949, everything breaks. That night, 58-year-old Laura Showalter is attacked in Anchorage. During an attempted sexual assault, she is brutally killed. The details that come out later are ugly and simple. Harvey Carignan would be identified as the offender and eventually arrested and charged with the murder. However, before that arrest occurred, just weeks later, on the 16th of September 1949, he strikes again. This time the victim is another woman, Christine Norton. He attempts to sexually assault her as well, but she manages to survive. And with a clear description of her assailant and a name, the next day Harvey is picked up by police. Now he is facing two serious charges: the murder of Laura and an assault with an intent to commit sexual assault on Christine. In the courtroom in Alaska, the picture that's painted is pretty straightforward. A young soldier already in trouble with the law who has escalated to lethal violence. A jury convicts him of first-degree murder and assault with intent to rape. And the judge sentences him to death by hanging for the murder, with an additional term for the assault. And for a while, it looks as though that was that, the end of the story. Harvey arrives on death row as just another condemned man in a territory where the death penalty is still very much in use. He sits in a cell, waiting for the hangman's noose. But behind the scenes, lawyers start picking at the way the case was put together. The key issue is his confession. Because yes, he indeed did make a confession. One of the officers who interrogated Harvey offered him a deal that was never his to give, telling him in essence that if he confessed to the murder, he would not be executed. That promise alone, made in an interrogation room, becomes the crack in the whole case. And on appeal, the courts decide that the confession was improperly obtained and must be thrown out. In 1951, Harvey wins a new trial on the murder charge. Once the confession is suppressed, the prosecution's case against him for the killing of Laura Showalter collapses. Eventually, the murder charge is dismissed. The death sentence, gone. It is a huge legal victory, and for the future victims we know about now, a catastrophic one. The assault conviction for the attack on Christine Norton, however, still stands. For that, Harvey is ordered to serve 15 years. He's transferred in 1952 to one of the toughest institutions at the time in the federal system, Alcatraz. Out in San Francisco Bay, surrounded by cold water and high walls, Alcatraz is meant to be where the worst of the worst in the system are kept, away from everyone else. Harvey does his time there through the 1950s. Now, there's no clear sign that anything about the place softens him at all, though. When the parole board finally signs off on his release around 1960, he isn't walking out of prison as a rehabilitated man with a plan. He's a career criminal in his early 30s who has just dodged the hangman's noose on a technicality. Within months of that parole, he finds himself back in trouble. In Minnesota, he and his brother Clinton, who also is a parolee from Alcatraz, are arrested for attempted third-degree burglary, and both men are convicted. Harvey is sent away again, this time to Leavenworth, another big federal penitentiary. He would serve 4 years and is paroled on the 2nd of March 1964. Now, if you're keeping count, this is a pattern. Harvey gets out, Harvey offends, Harvey goes back in. In November of 1964, only months after his release from Leavenworth, he's arrested again. This time in Washington state for second-degree burglary. Found guilty and handed a 15-year sentence. But once again, the system doesn't hold him for the full term. He's paroled in 1968. Not long after, he's back inside for a year on a parole violation, and then out again. By the early 1970s, Harvey Louis Carignan is a man in his 40s with a dismissed death sentence for a sexual assault and murder in Alaska, a 15-year term served for a violent sexual assault, multiple burglary convictions in Minnesota and Washington, and repeated parole failures. But because the most serious conviction in the murder was wiped away, he is still, on paper, just another reoffender with a history of violence, drifting between jobs and states. It's in this space, a man with a long record, a knack for slipping through legal fingers, and a lifetime of unresolved rage and distorted sexuality, that the next phase of his life begins. A battered truck, a gas station, a small ad offering work, a teenage girl looking for a job. By the early 1970s, Harvey Louis Carignan had once again blended back into the world. A man who should never have been free, but somehow kept slipping through every crack the justice system left open. After serving time in Alaska for the brutal killing of a young woman, his conviction was overturned on appeal because of a technical error. Rather than being retried, he was paroled. What followed was a trail of assaults, sexual assaults, and violent attacks that stretched across multiple states. He would eventually earn his name, the Wanted Killer. Carignan would spend a few months drifting through the Pacific Northwest, picking up work wherever he could, using different names and reinventing himself each time he felt the heat of suspicion. By 1972, he had settled into Washington state, and that's where his predatory pattern began to evolve into something far more calculated. In March of that year, a teenage girl accepted a ride from a man she just met. He was older, seemed steady, almost protective. Someone safe enough to offer her a lift home. But when he turned down a dirt road, she realized too late she was trapped. This man pulled out a hammer and brought it down on her skull with savage force. She was assaulted and left for dead in a wooded area, but somehow managed to survive. Her fractured skull and blurred memory would be the only clues police had to go on. She tried to describe her attacker, She said he was a thick-set man with a heavy voice, driving an older car. She didn't know his name. Only weeks later, another girl came forward, and then another, each describing almost the same thing. The hammer, the assault, the sudden shift from small talk to monstrous violence. None of the victims knew each other. None could identify the man who attacked them indefinitely. Detectives couldn't connect the cases, and Carignan moved on long before anyone realized that a serial predator was operating across state lines. By 1974, he'd relocated to Minnesota. Outwardly, he was just another middle-aged man trying to make ends meet. He lived quietly, worked odd jobs, and blended seamlessly again into small-town life. But beneath that facade, of course, Carignan had perfected a new method of hunting. He started scouring newspaper classifieds and bulletin boards, places where young women often left their names and phone numbers looking for part-time work. Babysitting, house cleaning, secretarial help, yard work. These ads gave him exactly what he needed. A steady list of potential victims who trusted strangers. Carignan would call them pretending to offer small jobs, sometimes leaving his own ads under fake names to lure them in. When a woman responded, he'd arrange to meet her under the pretext of work and then isolate her, far from anyone who could hear the screams. The pattern was chilling in its simplicity, and the social norms of the 1970s made it all too easy. For many young women, accepting a lift or taking a quick cash job was harmless enough, even responsible by some standards. That normalcy became the camouflage for his continued violence. On the evening of June 11th, 1974, 15-year-old Kathy Sue Miller finished her shift at a fast food restaurant in Minneapolis and would disappear shortly after. Witnesses say they last saw her getting to a car with an older-looking man. When her body was found days later in a rural field outside the city, investigators were confronted with a scene of unrestrained brutality. She had been sexually assaulted and bludgeoned to death. The weapon, a hammer. The precision of the blows suggested control, experience, and a rage that went far beyond impulse. Just weeks later, another teenager, 17-year-old Michelle Maria Steele, was reported missing. Her body was eventually found under eerily similar circumstances. Same kind of injuries, same pattern of assault, same remoteness of the dump site. Both victims had vanished after contact with a man promising work. Both had been beaten with a blunt instrument. Both had been discarded like refuse in the wilderness outside the city. Investigators were beginning to sense a pattern. But with no actual witnesses and no direct link between the girls, the cases stalled. Carignan, meanwhile, continued to refine his system. He studied his victims before he approached them. He paid attention to who looked desperate for work, who seemed naive enough to trust him, who lived alone or could disappear for days without being missed. He prowled gas stations and grocery stores, where flyers offering casual labour jobs were pinned to corkboards. Each new victim was chosen as carefully as his weapon. And his weapon was always the same, a hammer. Then came the attack that would finally break his anonymity. On September 30 of 1974, a 16-year-old girl answered an offer of work from a man who said he needed help clearing out an old property. They would meet at a service station where she got into his truck, trusting him as countless other girls had. But instead of heading to the job site, he drove her deep into the countryside. And there, in a secluded spot far from the road, he savagely beat her with a hammer and again assaulted her. Believing she was dead, he left her there. But she wasn't. She managed to crawl to a nearby road, bloodied, half-conscious, and was found by a driver who took her to hospital. And when she woke up, she remembered everything. His face, his voice, his build, and even the make and colour of his truck. It was the first clear description police had ever received. They immediately released the details to the public, and within days, investigators in Minneapolis tracked down a vehicle that matched it perfectly. The owner was a 48-year-old drifter with a long, violent history. A man who'd once been convicted of murder and had somehow convinced a parole board he was no longer a threat. His name was Harvey Louis Carignan. The arrest came quickly. Officers surrounded his Minneapolis home, a modest, cluttered rental filled with the trappings of a quiet bachelor. Tools, half-finished projects, piles of newspapers. But it was what they found in his truck that ended any notion of normalcy. Under the seat, police recovered a claw hammer. More importantly, it was stained, though it had clearly been cleaned multiple times. In the cab, they also found hair fibres and traces of blood. When the crime lab matched those samples to the surviving victim, it left little doubt. The man they had in custody was her attacker. When detectives began checking his history, the shock deepened. He had been convicted of murder before, a killing in Alaska 24 years earlier. The only reason he wasn't serving a life sentence was because of a legal technicality. A technicality that had set a killer free. Carignan was calm in custody, almost bored. He didn't deny knowing the girl. In fact, he offered an explanation that sounded rehearsed. That she'd misunderstood, that she'd consented, that she panicked afterward. It was a line he'd used before. One he seemed confident would work again, but this time police weren't operating in the dark. The surviving victim's testimony gave them leverage, and forensic evidence was beginning to build a bridge between Carignan and the unsolved murders of Kathy Sue Miller and Michelle Steele. As detectives dug deeper, they began piecing together a chilling pattern of behaviour. He would trawl through local newspapers looking for help wanted or for hire listings, singling out young women who might be desperate enough to respond to a stranger's offer of work. He'd lure them to isolated places with promises of easy money, sometimes even picking them up at their homes. And once they were alone, the shift came instantly. No warning, no argument, no hesitation. He would strike first. A hammer to the skull. And everything that followed was mechanical, practiced, and devoid of any form of emotion. Investigators traced at least 4 additional assaults in the region to the same method. The evidence suggested he had been attacking women for years, moving from one state to another whenever suspicion grew. His past parole record showed that he had been investigated for similar crimes in Alaska, Illinois, and Washington. Always against young women, always involving blunt force trauma. Each time there had been either insufficient evidence or procedural errors that saw the cases quietly dropped. It was a catalogue of systematic failures. In November of 1974, prosecutors charged him with assault and attempted murder for the attack of the surviving victim. The trial moved swiftly. Her testimony was calm, unwavering, and powerful. She described the sound of gravel under the tyres, the metallic tang of blood in her mouth, and the dull, rhythmic blows of the hammer as he struck her. It was more than enough to put him behind bars for 40 years. But that was only the beginning. While Carignan sat awaiting sentencing, detectives continued working the open murder case of Kathy Miller and Michelle Steele. The similarities were undeniable. The hammer, the isolated locations, the sexual assault. But what clinched it were the forensic tests on the fibres and hair recovered from his vehicle and home. They matched fibres found on Miller's clothing. When confronted with the results, Carignan smirked and said nothing. He didn't have to. The evidence spoke for him. Investigators also discovered a disturbing psychological pattern behind his crimes. He didn't show guilt or empathy, only irritation that he'd been caught. He spoke about his victims with disdain, calling them stupid girls and easy targets. One psychiatrist wrote that he was driven by compulsive sexual aggression. linked to potentially deep-seated resentment towards women. Another noted his obsession with control, how he used the want ads as a way to decide who lived and who died. Each ad, each phone call was an act of power. For prosecutors, the case was clear. Harvey Louis Carignan was no drifter who'd lost his temper. He was a serial predator who'd spent decades refining his methods. By 1975, the charges expanded to include multiple counts of murder, attempted murder, and sexual assault across 2 states. The press dubbed him the want ad killer, a name that captured both his manipulation and his cruelty. But even as the evidence mounted, Carignan refused to admit guilt. He told one reporter from his jail cell, "They're trying to make me into some kind of monster. But I never killed nobody." When asked about the women who had identified him, he sneered and said, "They're all mixed up. They don't know what they saw." The interviews became more erratic as time went on, his calm facade slipping into visible anger whenever the subject of his past came up. By the spring of 1975, the picture of Harvey Carignan was finally clear. A man who spent nearly 30 years drifting from one coast to another, leaving a trail of victims that stretched from Anchorage to Minneapolis. Each time, it exploited the same loopholes, the same misplaced trust, the same complacency of those who believed a man like him could ever change. But before the court could even begin the process of sentencing him for murder, there was one more story that would surface. One more case that would reveal just how much blood he had spilled before anyone stopped him. In early 1975, the courtroom in Minneapolis was silent as Harvey Louis Carignan took his seat at the defense table. He looked ordinary enough, clean-shaven, neat shirt, heavy set, quite unremarkable. To anyone who didn't know his name, he could have passed for a mechanic, a tradesman, maybe a tired man who'd seen too much of life. But the detectives who'd spent years chasing his shadow knew far better. Behind that plain exterior sat a predator who had been hiding in the open for decades. The prosecution began with the case they knew they would win: the assault and attempted murder of the 16-year-old girl who had survived. She testified in front of a packed courtroom. Her voice steady, she described the hammer in his hand, the pain as it came down again and again, and how she managed to crawl toward the sound of traffic to save her own life. Every word drew a clearer picture of Carignan's violence, and every juror's face hardened as they listened to the words. It was impossible to escape the feeling that they were hearing from someone who had looked directly into evil and lived to talk about it. The evidence left little room for doubt. The hammer, the hair, the bloodstains, the fibres, all linked to Carignan. And then came the pattern, the classified ads, the phone calls, the other missing girls. Even when the defense tried to paint the attack as a misunderstanding, the forensic evidence crushed the argument. When the verdict eventually came down, guilty on all counts, Carignan showed no reaction. He simply stared straight ahead, hands folded, as the judge sentenced him to 40 years in prison for attempted murder and assault. However, of course, investigators weren't finished with him. The Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension reopened the unsolved murders of 15-year-old Kathy Sue Miller and 17-year-old Michelle Steele. Detectives retraced every step Carignan had taken that summer. The want ads, the phone records, the gas stations where he'd been seen. One by one, the threads began to connect. The distinctive blows from the hammer, the assaults, and the locations of the bodies all pointed to one man. By the time the case reached court again later that year, prosecutors had built a mountain of evidence against him. Witnesses testified that Carignan had been seen near the areas where the victims disappeared. A young woman even recalled how he'd approached her after she'd posted an ad for babysitting work, asking her to meet him at a remote address. Luckily for her, she declined. And later, when she saw his face on the evening news, she realized just how close she'd come to joining the list of his victims. In 1975, Harvey Louis Carignan was convicted of first-degree murder in the killing of Kathy Miller. In a separate case, he was sentenced for the murder of Michelle Steele. The judge described him as a cold predator who has forfeited the right to live among human beings. Those words didn't move him. Throughout the proceedings, he maintained his innocence, claiming the police had framed him, the witnesses were mistaken, and the system was against him. Psychologists who examined him described something different. A man without empathy or remorse. Someone whose mind twisted every accusation into an imagined slight against him. They noted how easily he lied, how convincingly he played the victim, and how his only regret really was being caught. One psychiatrist called it psychopathic self-denial, a total rejection of guilt so absolute that even the truth couldn't penetrate it. In interviews from prison, Carignan would still talk in circles, insisting he'd been misunderstood. "They say I killed all those girls," he told one reporter, "but nobody ever proved that. I did my time for what they said I did, and that's that." Yet in the background, investigators from Alaska and Washington quietly revisited older files, assaults and disappearances that matched his methods perfectly. In each case, the same tools, the same brutality, the same deliberate use of isolation. They knew they were looking at the same man. They just couldn't prove it. Over the years, Carignan's name faded from headlines, replaced by newer monsters, newer crimes. But within law enforcement circles, his file remained a cautionary tale. He had slipped through the system twice. One in Alaska after his original murder, conviction was overturned, and again in the years between his early assaults and final arrest. He'd moved freely without parole supervision, using aliases, answering want ads, and exploiting the innocence of young women who only wanted work. By the time of his final incarceration, detectives believe Carignan may have been responsible for at least half a dozen murders and countless assaults stretching from 1949 to 1974. Most of those women's names never made it into the papers. They were the forgotten, the lost threads in a pattern of violence that spanned a quarter of a century. Harvey Louis Carignan spent the rest of his life in prison, never confessing, never apologizing. In 2023, at the age of 95, he died behind bars, a frail shadow of the man who had once terrorized the Midwest. To the end, he insisted he was innocent, but the evidence told a different story, of a killer who had perfected the art of deception and used society's trust as his weapon. For decades, he hid behind newspaper ads, the promise of a job, the illusion of safety. And every time someone answered the phone, believing they were about to make a few dollars, unknowingly they were stepping into the path of a man who saw them as nothing more than prey. The want-ad killer was finally gone, but his story remained a grim reminder of how evil can disguise itself in the most ordinary of forms. Crime at Bedtime is a Mashed Pumpkin production. Created, hosted and produced by Jack Lawrence. Audio and sound design by Jack Lawrence of Mashed Pumpkin Productions and Dom Evans and James Costa of ESO.